One of the mistakes I've seen on a lot of people's websites is that they give people too many options. So they're like, call us, text us, fill out this form, fax us. Here's our mailing address, send us some mail. There's too many options. And I always like to, when we're training our intake coordinator team at Productive Therapist, I always point out that when people are reaching out for therapy, they're in crisis, some level of crisis. It might be mild to moderate, but it might be severe. So they're not exactly in the best place to make difficult decisions. So choose one main option and guide them easily and tell them what to do so that they don't have to work too hard to figure it out.
Hello. Welcome to today's session of Selling the Couch. I hope you're doing well, having an incredible day. So today's podcast is asking this question of, should I hire an intake coordinator for my private practice? Whether you are a solo practitioner or a group practitioner, I think this episode will be incredibly helpful for you. And more than anything, I think will give you some barometers in order to think about whether an intake coordinator does make sense for you. I'm joined by Uriah Guilford at productivetherapist.com. Uriah is based in Northern California. He's a group practice owner and also owns Productive Therapist, which is a company that has virtual assistants and intake coordinators. And Uriah has definitely been through the fire, has been a group practice owner since 2015, and has learned a lot about the intake coordinator journey, hired many intake coordinators, and has learned kind of what works and what doesn't work, what questions to ask, how to train, and all of these different things. We start our conversation with a really basic question of what in the world is an intake coordinator, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Then we dive into the more nitty-gritty. How would you know as a solo practitioner whether an intake coordinator makes sense for you? And how would you know as a group practice owner of when it would make sense for you? And then we dive into some of these responsibilities of an intake coordinator, how hiring the right intake coordinator can really help you get some of those hours back in the day, but also you can leverage that position into helping your practice in multiple ways. And then we get into data privacy. How do you think about and how do you handle data privacy? Because the intake coordinator presumably is going to be the first person that a potential client is talking to, and how do you sort of handle all of that kind of stuff? And I think Uriah's answer is pretty interesting because it really does depend on the situation. And then we dive into a couple of different logistical things. What happens if an intake coordinator gets sick or goes on vacation? How do you sort of triage and handle calls that are coming in? What's a top mistake that Uriah sees clinicians making in hiring an intake coordinator? And then we wrap up with what are the metrics that Uriah thinks about when trying to determine whether an intake coordinator makes sense for both a solo and a group practitioner. I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation. Even if you have no plans right now to hire an intake coordinator, I think conversations like this are incredibly helpful because I think they help us to think about how we can design our practices in a way that is sustainable for us so that we're not trying to juggle all of the things that it comes to when it comes to private practice ownership. So here's my conversation with Uriah Guilford from productivetherapist.com. Hey, Uriah, welcome to Selling the Couch.
Thanks, Melvin. I'm excited to be on your podcast.
I know, we were just talking right before. Man, I can't believe we touched base in 2018, and it's a little ridiculous. Like, I have to publicly apologize that it's taken this long for you to come on the podcast. You are doing some amazing things for our field, sharing some just incredibly helpful things, and I'm thankful for you. I'm thankful that we get to have a conversation on intake coordinators
Yes.
and just the whole process of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of my absolute favorite things to do, to go out and collect resources and find cool things, whether it's software or podcasts or all kinds of resources for therapists, and share them. That's my favorite thing to do.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And I'm looking at your background and I'm like, man, Mario. And we have so many, it's what is that, Mario, Super Mario?
So look, what's behind me is my original Super Nintendo with a tube TV.
Wow.
Yes. So I can
how
turn around and
cool
play
is that?
some Super Mario Brothers anytime.
How awesome is that? That like brings back good memories, like original like Mario, Duck Hunt, all that stuff.
So much fun.
So much fun. So I had a bunch of questions for you, but I wanted to start here. I know that most of us probably know the answer on this, but I don't want to like make any assumptions. So what exactly is an intake coordinator, particularly related to private practice?
Sure. Yeah, an intake coordinator, sometimes referred to as a client care coordinator, is the person who's in charge and manages that initial contact between the client and the clinician. And they're really in charge of the whole intake process. And it's their job to create a smooth and welcoming experience for new clients. I like to say it's their role to kind of smooth the pathway from that first contact to the first session. And it's such a valuable and important role for the client experience and for the start of therapy.
I love the fact that you talked about it as a smooth path because I can imagine for many people to make that decision to call and seek out therapy is a hard one. And then just making it a smooth and joyful process, even from that call. And then also, I know that I'm sure all of us have heard these stories where someone reaches out to a therapist and they never hear back, right? So there's that other side of it, of the courage it took and then not hearing back. And then the other side of it, right, as clinicians, like, clinicians maybe are perhaps slammed or whatever it is, right? And they're just not able to. So there's so many layers to it. And I love the fact that you use the word smooth.
Yeah, there are so many challenges on both sides. And interestingly enough, in the last 2 weeks or so, I've been doing a handful of intake audits where I'm actually sort of reviewing people's intake process and pretending to be a client from landing on their website to reaching out, filling out their form, even going so far as to get added to their EHR as a client and go through the consent form process. It's super interesting to see it from the client perspective. And one of my conclusions is that it's still too hard to find a good therapist and actually start and complete the process to get in to see a good therapist. Even with all the resources that we have now, it's still very, very difficult.
When you were doing that whole like audits like that, where did you see like common hiccup? Is it just the amount of steps that we're taking, or what was happening?
Yeah, there's a number of things. The first thing that comes to mind is the challenge of actually finding a therapist and then reaching out and getting a quick response. So almost no one picks up their phone. That hasn't changed in years. Some larger group practices maybe have an intake coordinator that can answer the phone live, which is really helpful. But the majority of the time, someone is calling or even reaching out by text to a therapy practice. There's a delay of hours to days to actually get things started. So it's just really slow.
The other thing you mentioned is you went through websites and like filled out forms. Have you found anything like that where majority of clients are like filling out online forms versus like calling phones? Like, is there any like broader trends that you've noticed?
There's usually a number of contact options that people have on their website. It's usually a form, a phone number, and maybe there's some other options there. My favorite is online scheduling so that the potential client can actually schedule a call with the therapist or with the intake coordinator to talk about their needs and talk about what kind of therapist they're looking for. So those are usually the options that most people put out there. And people, the preference of potential clients depends on so many different factors. Some younger people would prefer to text or just, schedule online. And then a lot of people we've noticed in my practice still want to call. So it's across the spectrum. Yeah.
So I guess broadly, it probably is wise to offer different options until you've kind of gotten clarity of like, oh, this is where our like disproportionately these calls are coming from.
Yeah, my advice to practice owners, whether they're solo or group, is to choose the most ideal contact method for them and then highlight that. One of the mistakes I've seen on a lot of people's websites is that they give people too many options. So they're like, call us, text us, fill out this form, fax us. Here's our mailing address, send us some mail. There's too many options. And I always like to, when we're training our intake coordinator team at Productive Therapist, I always point out that when people are reaching out for therapy, they're in crisis, some level of crisis. It might be mild to moderate, but it might be severe. So they're not exactly in the best place to make difficult decisions. So choose one main option and guide them easily and tell them what to do so that they don't have to work too hard to figure it out.
Yeah, right. And especially if someone, whatever level of crisis they're in, usually their mind is of like single focus, right? They're not able to sort of process like multiple things. And I would imagine like too many options would often lead to more overwhelm and then I'm not making a call or going to clicking on somewhere else or, trying to find some other options or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How would a solo practitioner know when it's time to consider hiring an intake coordinator?
Yeah, great question. So I actually created a quiz a little while ago for people to figure out if they're ready for an intake coordinator. So if folks want to go to productivetherapist.com/quiz, they can take that quiz. It's a good one. I would say though, for most solo practices, they won't ever need an intake coordinator. That's my honest answer, even though that's one of our main services. If you're a solo practitioner, most likely you can use technology to automate or streamline most of that initial contact and the process of getting a client into your practice. Modern EHRs are fantastic, and online scheduling platforms are excellent. So if I was going to start a solo practice again today, I know you did that not too long ago. I have some very specific ideas about how I would do that. I would just go ahead and use Simple Practice and use the scheduling option in the client portal for people to schedule a 15-minute phone call. That's how I've always done it. And then I would talk to them. And then if it was a good fit, set them up in my EHR and we'd be off to the races. And I would put that widget on my website so people could just click, see my availability and schedule. So that's what I would do if I was a solo practice. At this point, no need for an intake coordinator.
I guess, is there ever a scenario where a solo practitioner would need an intake coordinator?
Yes, actually.
What?
So my initial answer is no, you don't need an intake coordinator. But my follow-up would be, there are some solo practice owners that are incredibly busy, right? I'm sure you know some of these folks. They see 20, 30, 35 plus clients. Or maybe they're a professor at a university. And maybe they are doing coaching or they have a side business of some sort. And they really do need somebody to kind of run point and manage their entire schedule. Maybe even do some sort of executive assistant kind of functions. So at Productive Therapist, we do provide virtual assistants for some solo practices. And it tends to be those folks that have a very busy caseload or they have other things going on and they just need to hand off that part of their practice.
Turning to the other side, how would a group practitioner know when it's time?
Take my quiz. No.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's a difficult thing to figure out because when you're starting a group practice, when you're growing a group practice, you don't necessarily have a lot of free time or money. In the beginning, you might have a little bit more time than money. Most group practice owners wait too long to hire an intake coordinator. And what they usually end up doing is they hold that role for themselves. And I totally understand this because this was my story back in 2015. That's when I started my group practice. Same year you started STC, I think.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yep.
So I remember vividly right next door to the office where I am at right now, many nights a week, 9 p.m., kind of slouched in my chair, just finished a bunch of sessions with teenage boys and their families. I was exhausted, checking my email and seeing that new calls had come in and wanting desperately to connect those people with our services, but also being drained of my energy and realizing it was too late and I didn't have the time to do it. And then the next day I'd have to try to get back to them. Meanwhile, I was writing all the blog posts, doing the networking, managing our QuickBooks, all of the things, that a group practice owner does. So my short answer is hire an intake coordinator as soon as you can. As soon as you can afford it, it's a good idea. It will help you grow so much.
Is that again, I'm just asking these naive questions. It seems like an intake coordinator is, in addition to perhaps a clinical coordinator, those seem like important first hires for a group practitioner.
I would say intake coordinator first, most likely, because the practice owner is likely going to be potentially the first clinical supervisor or the actual acting clinical director for a while until they grow enough to hire someone else into that role. And in my opinion, the intake coordinator is like the MVP. They're one of the most important people in the practice. And so besides hiring clinicians for a group practice, obviously you can't have a group without another therapist. Intake coordinator is the way to go. Yeah. Interestingly enough, I started working with virtual assistants back in 2012. So it was back in my days of solo practice. And I was very, very fortunate to work with an amazing woman named Gina, and worked with her for 5 years. And her role kind of developed over time, but eventually she was my intake coordinator. She was responding to new inquiries, setting them up in the EHR, et cetera. And it was such a wonderful experience. And then unfortunately, she passed away from cancer. And it was really sad because we had worked together for so long. And this was obviously way pre-pandemic. We never saw each other on video. We did everything basically over email. Yeah, it was amazing. So that was so sad. And then I was in the position of, growing this group practice, and I just lost one of my most important support staff. And so that actually prompted me to start Productive Therapist to solve my problem of needing part-time administrative support. And the rest is history.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
How did you, like Uriah, like make the shift in your mind of I can handle these calls, I can respond to these calls, to I need to delegate this because long term this is going to be the smart and strategic move? Because I feel like a lot of clinicians struggle with this, which is, I mean, it's like the E-Myth Revisited, right? Most private practitioners are technicians, right? And so our natural tendency then is to try to do everything.
Yeah. It's really hard. It's a very difficult thing to let go of. I mean, delegating in general is hard for any small business owner, but the intake coordinator role is so important. And when you're a solo practice or a new group practice owner, like it feels you're so close to it. And it feels like you need to be that person talking to each and every client, making sure you guide them to the right therapist, to the right services. And if I bring in somebody else to do that, what if they do a really poor job? And what if people don't get the care that they need? And what if I don't know what's going on? There's so many what ifs. It's very difficult to let go of that. It was for me, certainly, because I thought to myself, I'm actually really good at this. And I actually love doing it. I love talking to, parents of teenagers, and they're struggling, their family's struggling. Like, this is why I do the work, right? And so connecting them with the best therapist is like such a good feeling. So to let go of that was very, very hard. But I found somebody and hired them, and I thought to myself, this is going to work out okay, but it's not going to be as good as it was when I was doing it, right? The numbers wouldn't be as good. And I don't know if you know what I'm going to say here. You probably don't, but the results were better. My intake coordinator did better than me. And I was kind of shocked. So I never went back from there.
Yeah, it requires I don't know, it's such a practical decision, but it's a mental decision as well to like transition away and then like let go of these roles, trusting that, in some situations it ends up better, but then like other situations it doesn't, but then the freedom,
true.
right?
Yes.
Like the freedom that you gain could be really beneficial too. And the mental bandwidth, right? I could
It's
imagine
huge.
like, right, like that Uriah who's got like a full day of clients and then realizes I had to return all these calls, and then like how present or, would it be like the next day where you're like, oh, I got to return those calls. Wait, I have a full day.
It's heavy.
It is heavy.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Melvin. I hope you're enjoying today's podcast session. Before we continue, just wanted to let you know two quick things. One is STC Elite, our mastermind for therapists creating their first online course, is open for enrollment. We only do this a few times a year. If you have been thinking about creating an online course but looking for accountability and just a community of other therapists to launch your online course with, to get feedback, to refine your course, all of that stuff, definitely check it out over at sellingthecouch.com/mastermind. Or the other option is actually to check out our Course Creator Starter Kit. Validating an online course idea is one of the most important steps that you can take as a therapist. And we put together a free 7-day email course to help you get that done. You can sign up for that over at sellingthecouch.com/course kit. We'll jump right back in. What are like the top 3 responsibilities that you see for an intake coordinator?
Yeah. So mainly they're handling the initial client contact. They're scheduling the first appointment, setting that client up in the EHR. And then broadly, they're handling general admin and client requests. Maybe the clients reach out and they need a super bill, or they need to reschedule, or other sorts of back office things, updating credit cards. So the role is primarily client facing for that initial contact and walking those people through the process. But then generally intake coordinators do a handful of other things that are very helpful to the practice, sort of on the administrative assistant side.
I love that you broke that down. So, three things: handling the initial call, scheduling that initial appointment, and then general sort of catch-all admin things, super
Right.
bill, reschedule. I love particularly that you included that last one because I could imagine that could be another way you could get like sucked right back into coordinating all these things if you're having to handle reschedules or even like provide super bills, all that kind of
It gets
stuff.
to be a lot. Yeah, it really does. And then, I mean, depending on the practice, usually the person in that role, unless the practice is larger and they're truly just doing intake coordination, they're probably handling other tasks too. Like our virtual assistants will schedule social media posts. They will handle some of the basic billing tasks and other things like that. So if you hire a really good person, they likely can help you with other things too. So it can be a little bit broader or narrower as needed.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is there may be times where it's like those three roles, like one is more highlighted than other times, and that's like really normal. And then I guess the other thing I hear is there's probably going to be a little bit of a time where the person gets into a flow with your practice. So don't like be disheartened if it's like not smooth sailing in the first like week or two or something like
It takes some time to get into a rhythm and a routine. And depending on whether or not the person you hire has done the intake coordinator job before, or if they just have some, maybe they have a psychology background or something, or maybe an administrative assistant background, but they need to be trained on how to provide these services in a mental health setting. So you really have to spend time obviously hiring the right person and then giving them enough training so that they're really solid, they're ready to go before they even answer an email or respond to a phone call.
Speaking of which, like, what things should you have in place since like client data is, potentially being shared even at that onset? Like there may be situations where you've never even touched base with a client, but they're talking to this to your intake coordinator and getting
Right.
information. So
Yeah, good question. Digital security and privacy obviously is very important. It always has been. It used to be so simple back in the day because we just had paper forms and we had voicemail. Like that was it, right?
yeah,
Things have changed. So
I feel
now,
like
I mean,
in less than a decade, right?
truly, truly, like if you think 2015 to 2025, vastly different landscape for what we do with private practice. Yeah, so interesting. In any case, if the intake coordinator is a W-2 employee, you're basically covered by your employee handbook, and you should have things in there that relate to how sensitive data PHI is handled, and you should be covered by that. Obviously, you have to keep up with that and make sure that they're following those procedures. And then if you are working with a freelance virtual assistant or an agency, such as Productive Therapist, you just want to make sure that there's a business associates agreement in place, often called a BAA. And that just details exactly what the responsibilities are of that virtual assistant or the agency and how they will handle any sort of privacy breaches. So those are the two ways to go about that, whether it's an employee or essentially a contractor.
And then the other side of this, right? Like intake coordinators obviously aren't robots, right? So how do you handle
Not yet.
things? Not yet. I feel like I know I hesitated on that question. I was like, because now being on LinkedIn, like there's somebody I followed. They're like, what do they call it? Humanoids, right? Like
Oh,
he's doing,
really?
yeah. And it's like fascinating. I'm like, so he'll like make a video, and then there's like a robot walking in the background. I'm like,
Whoa.
yeah. But how do you handle things like if the intake coordinator is like sick or goes on vacation or something like that? I mean, is it just like looping somebody in, or is it you take, I don't know. I would love to hear how you think about
Yeah.
that.
There's a couple different solutions for that. For a small to medium sized practice, likely the owner is going to step in and just take over. That usually works out fine, unless there's some vacations that are overlapping. But in a larger practice, there's generally an intake team. So there might be multiple intake coordinators. And if that's not the case, one other solution, so like a third solution, would be cross-training one of the clinicians in the practice to be able to step in and sort of cover for that vacation or that illness. Those are usually the things that most people do.
What are you defining as like a small to medium-sized practice versus a large one?
It depends on, people can define that differently. I think 5 to 15 clinicians is small to medium, and then large would be 20 plus.
Yeah, so even it's so interesting, like, I was thinking like transition from like an agency to solo practitioner, there's like that transition from a solo practitioner to like a group practitioner, there's that transition. But then even within group practices, like there's transitions
There's
as you,
step ups.
yeah,
Yes.
as you add
Yes.
employees and different things. And even I was thinking, like, if you are a group practice owner, or like if you're a solo practitioner that's starting a group, but you're imagining at some point having like 25, 30 clinicians, there's wisdom in like thinking, like, yeah, I'm going to eventually have an intake team. So, how do I both simultaneously build this in the moment while potentially even cross training and thinking
Right.
through, like, how a team
Yeah.
can emerge as we concurrently get bigger versus like, oh gosh, now we need a team because we're so overwhelmed.
It can, growth can happen fast at times, right? And so this is one of the pain points that I see most often is kind of scaling the support staff with the group practice growing is a challenge. And I think that's where productive therapist honestly comes in clutch, because we have a team of mental health trained, HIPAA certified virtual assistants that can step in, and the practice owners don't need to do very much at all to get going with those services. So I think like if I was starting over again, I would absolutely do it myself in the beginning, and then I would hire a mental health virtual assistant. And then the next sort of graduation, we've done this with many of our practices, is going from a mental health virtual assistant to an in-house intake coordinator. Because once the practice gets to a certain size, it just makes sense to go ahead and pay a W-2 employee. But that's kind of the stepwise way to do it. I will say that there's a lot of like finding the right person to hire and then training them, like I mentioned before. It's actually really difficult. And then keeping them and retaining them for months and years to come and having that stability in the practice, it's hard. If anyone has ever done this, even if you just put out a job application on, or not application, but a posting on Indeed for, mental health virtual or mental health intake coordinator, you'll get hundreds of applications. And then it's like, how do you pick the best one? It's not easy, but once you do find that person, you train them and you get them solidly in that position, it's an absolute game changer for the practice owner. It's huge.
Speaking of which, like, what are some, I ask a lot of really basic questions, but like, what are some like best practices to like retain these intake coordinators? Because I would think like the demand is quite high, and especially for like well-trained ones. I mean, is it a matter of, yeah, I mean, just like what are things that broadly you've seen?
That's a good question. So I told you that I worked with Gina for 5 years, and that was amazing, right? And then between Gina and Tiffany, I had a couple other intake coordinators that didn't stay super long. And then I worked with Tiffany for 6 years. So the last 6 years, Tiffany was providing those services to my practice. And I can't even tell you how much peace of mind and stability that brought to my practice. Now, how did I retain her? Well, I obviously treat her really, really well, pay her as well as I can, provide benefits, create not only a culture, but a practice where the systems are working smoothly so that there's not daily tension and frustration. So I think those are some of the things that come to mind. And yeah, if you give people a great place to work with meaningful things to do and people that they like talking to, they're likely going to stay.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that. I forgot exactly where, but like literally this morning I read some like government report saying that like people's satisfaction with job places are at like their lowest in like a very long time. So I mean, I
Really,
think it speaks to that like, that desire to like really create an environment where people stay, and
definitely.
are valued. I have two questions for you. What do you think is the top mistake that you see therapists making when trying to hire an intake?
Ooh, the top mistake, like the number one,
Yeah, like if I could only say one.
not doing it soon enough. Yeah, I would go back to that, not doing it soon enough. But if that was, let's say that's off the table, right? The biggest mistake that they make is not giving them enough training. Honestly, that would be the one, because a busy practice owner, whether they're solo or group, they don't have a lot of time or bandwidth. So once they do the work, the heavy lift of finding that person and hiring them, it's so easy to just want to say, okay, good luck. I hope it goes well. But most support staff in a mental health practice need a lot more training and support and coaching and mentorship than they get. So I would say providing enough training and support until they're really, really solid, and then you can step back.
Is there sort of I guess, a phased approach to that sort of training? So, i.e., like, in the initial stages, like running through some mock scenarios and then having them do like a call where like you're looking over there, you're with them. How do you sort of think about it and approach it?
Yeah, there's a couple different things that you can do. So when I was training my first intake coordinator, they were actually in this office that I'm in right now, in this space, and so it was very easy for me to. We actually recorded some calls, and with permission from the person on the phone. Obviously, we recorded some calls so that then I could listen to them and give him feedback. That's incredibly valuable. It's a little bit harder to do because it's sensitive and people don't necessarily want to consent to that. That's like the absolute best way to do it. The secondary was sometimes I would come in and I would listen to him on the phone while he was talking to a potential client. And then we would talk afterwards and I would give him some feedback. If it's virtual, you would have to record the call or just have a meeting after one or two intake calls and then kind of talk through it. And of course, you can do role plays and those kinds of things as well.
Awesome. Uri, the final question I have for you is, are there any metrics that either a solo or group practitioner should look at to determine like whether an intake coordinator is worth it? So for example, we've noticed like the number of folks calling to actually scheduling is increased by 25%, whatever it is.
Yeah, two metrics I would highlight. The first one is owner freedom. And that's a little bit harder to categorize. One of our sayings is that we help therapists get more done so they can have more fun. And when I was getting my first virtual assistant, my business coach at the time said, well, what are you going to do with the time that you save, whether it's 5 or 10 hours a week? And if you're going to use that time either for enjoying your family, your hobbies, or growing your business, then great. Yeah. So owner freedom is number one. But the second one really is your conversion rates. And that's just like terminology that means how many clients reach out and then how many become new clients. So your intake coordinator should do as well as you, or hopefully better over time. So you want that. And that's going to happen with more availability and a quicker response time. And of course the right person. So you want to keep a track on that.
It's awesome. Is there any sort of, I guess this could really vary by niche populations, but is there sort of a standard number like, you're doing really well if, 50% or 60% of your calls are converting or anything like that at all?
It's a little bit hard to get anything solid on that, but it seems like private pay practices tend to be a little bit lower because insurance practices, it's easier for those people to say yes because, if I call and you take my insurance, easy, and you have availability, easy. So insurance-based practices usually are between 40 to 60, sometimes higher, 80 or higher. And then private pay practices are usually in the range of 20 to 40%. I think my private pay practice got up to about 45, 50%, sometimes a little bit higher. Yeah. I don't know if that's helpful, but those are kind of the ranges.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I feel like we almost need to do like another episode on like conversion of like private pay practice for an intake coordinator. It'd be so interesting.
Yeah.
You're right. You're doing so much awesome stuff in the world. You've got a course as well to support therapists if they want to get their feet wet and think through this. Please do take a moment to tell us about the course and also
Absolutely.
how we can learn more about the awesome stuff you're doing in the world.
Definitely. Thanks. I appreciate that. So all of our resources are at productivetherapist.com. And we do have a course called the Intake Hiring Starter Pack. And essentially, we just took all of our best practices from hiring over 100 intake coordinators, which is a lot. And we put them into a course to kind of walk people through sort of a do-it-yourself process of, recruiting and hiring an intake coordinator. So I'm really proud of that course. And my team, I'm not involved in hiring anymore. My team does all the hiring. And so I brought them in to help me create that course. And so these are best practices on how to do all the things you need to do.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And you were so kind to give the STC community a little discount as well.
Absolutely.
On the course. And so I believe the discount code is STC, right?
Keep it simple. STC will give you 25% off that course. Yeah.
Perfect. Uri, thank you again. I really am just so grateful for you. I'm glad that, LinkedIn has enabled us to reconnect and
me too.
Grateful for all the work that you're doing in the world.
Thanks, Melvin. Appreciate it.
All right. Have a great rest of your day. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Uriah, and especially if you are in a season where you are considering an intake coordinator, or if you have an intake coordinator and you've just been struggling with how to best maximize their potential. I hope that today's podcast session has just been incredibly helpful for you. Yeah, it's just given you some new ideas in terms of how to approach it. As I was talking with Uriah, and I was just reflecting on this idea of how an intake coordinator is really like the symbolism of like working in our business versus on our business, and how it's this transition of when we realize that we can't do all of the things in order for our private practice to succeed, and then even like a hard realization that we may be the handicap or the roadblock that's holding our practice from where it should be. The STC equivalent of this has been for me is like hiring an executive assistant, because Mel, left to his own devices, will try to do everything possible with STC and do all of the things, because who else can do it better than Mel, right? But wiser Mel has coming to realize that there is something in letting things go and hiring out and hiring and asking for help, because at the end of the day, people can often do this better than I can. And then more importantly, or at least equally importantly, it frees up time to be able for us to do the work that we're the most gifted at. And so I think in terms of private practice, it's often serving your clients well, learning and getting versed in theoretical orientations and getting to be a better clinician. Uriah mentioned that they have an intake hiring starter pack. So if you go through sellingthecouch.com/intake hiring, sellingthecouch.com/intake hiring, and enter the promo code STC, you get 25% off of that course, if that's something that would be helpful for you on your private practice journey. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next time. Bye.